what we've always maintained. Listen, the Nevertron, I'll break it down into a couple of Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of Pacific ivory in the world.
Live in a third world nation where your votes will get stolen if you can vote there at all.
Dane Waters. It's always a great pleasure to be here. Today, I'm broadcasting from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. God, it looked like 27 hours to get here. It's amazing how just jet lag, though. So I apologize for any jet lag. So let's talk about what's happening around the world real quick before we get to our first guest. The war in Iran, which is technically over. The reality is, as I've maintained on the show so many times, that regime change was an important part, and not allowing Iran to have a nuclear weapon is very important as well. But I'm still struggling to figure out what America got out of this war. That's a conversation we're going to have next week. I applaud our government for standing up and saying, "Hey, this is enough." But it's definitely not the outcome that I and many of my friends and colleagues had expected. So we'll have to see how that is. In the UK, as we know, Keir Starmer's out. We've talked about that numerous times on the show as well. We'll see how the new he's not technically out. He has resigned, so we'll have to see how the new prime minister is. Hopefully, it's very important that the prime minister of the UK continues his support for the Ukraine and what's happening there. And speaking of Ukraine, I was speaking to some friends there earlier today. There's this big row between Ukraine and Poland about during World War II, there was a unit in Ukraine that it's questionable whether or not there was genocide against some of the Poles, and there's a unit that now wants to be called President Zelensky, of course, granted that name to them, and I think it's important to understand is that this unit, which is fighting on the front lines, defending Ukraine and Poland and the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, they chose that name, and of course, why would President Zelensky deny it if that's what they want on the front lines? But today's show, we will be talking about war zones and about what happens in war zones, and there's the human side of war that a lot of people overlook. So we will be talking about that with our. Let's take a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we'll be back with our first guest. Thanks a lot. There you go, Elly. My
what we've always maintained. Listen, the Nevertron, I'll break it down into a couple of Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of Pacific ivory in the world.
Live in a third world nation where your votes will get stolen if you can vote there at all.
Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters, and we're very honored to have with us today Elly Nott. Hello, Elly. How are you?
Good morning, Dane. Thanks so much for having me. Very well.
So we were just talking in the monologue about wars. I mean, as we all know, sadly, the world seems more consumed with violence and war than any time in the last generation. And tell us a little bit about yourself and how you are part of what's going on around the world.
Thanks. So 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, I set up a UK registered charity with my husband and co-founder, David Nott. So David had worked as a surgeon, trauma surgeon around the world for decades in any humanitarian emergency you could imagine, and also did a few missions with the British military as well in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we set up a charity that trains doctors in the surgical skills they need, provide relief and assistance in conflict zones. So we've now well over 2,700 surgeons, anaesthetists and OBGYNs in countries around the world, most particularly Syria, Ukraine, Palestine, Yemen, Libya, Moldova too. So we've done this work all around the world, trained thousands of surgeons. And the idea was that we would strengthen local healthcare systems. So there's the established model of Western aid agencies like MSF and the ICRC that go into countries experiencing conflict, and they provide healthcare services. But what we wanted to do was really focus on the local doctors. So when the aid agencies leave, you're left with stronger health systems and better trained surgeons that can then train their colleagues and take that forward and really build resilience in the health system.
Well, it's excellent. It's amazing. A lot of people don't understand. I mean, they think that when there's conflict, there's war. The military on both sides are fighting. But what's often overlooked is the human toll. What's happening. Because let's take a case study, for example. I know you guys you did some stuff in Gaza as well, correct?
Yes, so we've trained several hundred surgeons in the West Bank in Ramallah, and my husband as well, David, he went to Gaza as a volunteer surgeon, and also we've trained several cohorts of surgeons who've gone out to that conflict and volunteered their services, both in the UK, and we trained some Kuwaiti Red Crescent surgeons as well in Kuwait City.
And so how does this work? So so for example, you'll choose a war zone or a place that needs medical care. You guys go in, and do you bring additional doctors with you, or you just train doctors when you're there?
So we bring a training faculty. So it's usually about 6 doctors, but the idea is increasingly that we cultivate a local faculty. So the best example of what we do is undoubtedly Syria. So that's where the foundation started. It's where I was inspired to start the foundation. So David, back in, if you remember, in Aleppo in 2013 and 2014, Eastern Aleppo was under bombardment from the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad and his Russian allies, and absolutely being hammered day after day after day, indiscriminate bombing, barrel bombs, horrendous crimes against humanity. And basically David went and trained lots of the local doctors there. So the issue that you often have is that medical training, along with everything else, is in civilian life is really disrupted. And so you have these young, enthusiastic, but quite inexperienced young doctors. So David went in and really trained a lot of them up to be able to produce better results for patients, which he really did. So Syria is a particular example of a conflict that was, very much in the headlines 10 years ago, but gradually slipped away and away. But we really stuck with Syria. And we've always believed that actually what's crucial is staying with somewhere rather than just turning up once and leaving. You have really quite limited impact there. So we believe by repeat missions, having surgeons over here, we've got 4 Syrian surgeons in Edinburgh this week attending our hostile environment surgical training course in Edinburgh, which is on cadavers, people who have donated their bodies to science. And so we've always believed in really sticking with the place, showing that loyalty and consistency, and that data is important, but what's really important if you want to make an impact is building those bonds of friendship and connection and trust, most crucially with people, because people are a lot more receptive to what you have to say if you demonstrate that you're staying the course.
Well, I appreciate it. And outside the surgery part, though, you were just recently in Syria yourself. Outside of surgery, you do other things. Like, tell me about your recent trip to Syria.
So I've been in Syria 4 times since the liberation on 8th of December 2024, and I've traveled throughout the country. It's been really extraordinary to see, actually. Damascus, Homs, Hama, Aleppo, and also in Idlib too. And last week, I was launching a cervical cancer prevention program. We're very honored to have the First Lady of Syria join us and attend that, which was really important because in quite a conservative society like Syria, by the First Lady being there and lending her reputation to the program, it will hopefully encourage women to come forward for HPV screening, which is what the program is doing. And that's a really great example of what I love about my work, because it was totally led by the local Syrian doctors. One of my amazing colleagues, Saladin, he'd seen quite advanced gynecological cancers, an increasing number of them. And he thought so many of these can be prevented if we do screening, so catch the symptoms early, the changes in cells. So he said this is what he wanted to do, have a screening program, along with a really inspiring group of local Syrian doctors and local Syrian NGOs. They asked me to come forward and help them lead the program, which is what I did. But for me, that's just an example of how all humanitarian development work should be. It should be responding to what local people want and need for them and their communities. So yeah, it was was a great joy to be there. We continue to do our HEST training too, and we have specialist courses for anesthesia and obstetrics and gynecology too.
Interesting. Well, I had a guest on my show not too long ago. She's a Brit as well, and she's doing work in Lebanon, and her work there is about providing pads for women that have their menstrual cycles, because it's something that they just don't have access to, and it's just very difficult. So it's disposable pads and reusable pads, that kind of thing. And one thing we talked about was the fact that culturally, like in Lebanon, that a lot of some of the men don't necessarily support or understand or agree with the necessity of women's health care. Are you finding that in certain parts of the world as well?
We find in Syria, actually, there's a lot of recognition of the importance of women's healthcare, because women are so essential now. For it to rebuild, it really needs the emotional, intellectual resources of all of its full, and women are such a crucial part of that. Syrian women are amongst the most impressive, dynamic, amazing people I've ever met. And so I've been encouraging them to come forward and saying, you're important, your health is important. And so I think it's that it is taken seriously by their male colleagues, but as much as we can do to keep it at the top of their focus and priority list, we'll keep doing that for sure.
Well, it's definitely impressive that the First Lady was with you, because I think that's critical. With the First Lady involved, it definitely highlights it and makes it less difficult for women to not have the light or the opportunity to talk about these things as well. I mean, but doing work in war zones, I mean, it's one thing about training doctors and surgery, but if you're in a war zone and you're hearing bombs go off and things going on, I mean, it definitely requires some type of person to be able to do that, right?
Yeah, it certainly does. And yeah, again, David is fairly extraordinary. He's written a beautiful book called War Doctor, which is about his decades of experience in conflict zones. And there is a certain deep resilience I see in him that is in very few others. And, where that comes from, who knows, but he's certainly made of tough stuff, of steel. And it's not for everyone. And I think one of the things with the foundation is that we're very conscious of our which ones have had experience in those hottest of conflict zones and which ones don't. And so we're always sensitive to where we go. There's lots of risk assessments and research done before we go somewhere. But if it's somebody like David who just has this fire, this passion for teaching and for surgery and for getting right to where he's needed the most. He was in Kharkiv in Ukraine last summer, and it just meant so much to the local doctors that he went there. Because, as you know, lots of people go to Lviv and or even Kyiv and stop there, and that's admirable and fantastic. But I think really going to the front line and showing your solidarity and being where your skills are needed the most, it creates another level of that relationship of trust and connection with the local doctors.
I think it's a critical point as well, because, as you know, I've done a lot of work in Ukraine as well, and just, it's 4 years into the war. And many Ukrainians think that, okay, the world has forgotten about us. But I think that when Westerners go, Brits, Americans go, and to help support them, I think it helps give them greater confidence, the fact that the world has not forgotten about them. So, so let's talk. Well, first of all, I also have to say that it's amazing the relationship that you and David have, and the fact that you're working so well together on this, and that it's rare to find a husband and wife who are so in sync that they can actually pull this off, I should say. So I applaud you and David in that regard. So outside of Syria, where would you say has been the most rewarding place for you guys to go and operate?
I think it's actually been Ukraine. I mean, David was in there in the country within about 5 weeks of the full-scale invasion. And within 9 days, actually, him and Henry Marsh, who's a fantastic British neurosurgeon who'd been going to Ukraine for many years, doing neurosurgery and training local doctors. They'd set up an online course where they were trying to just download some instant trauma management skills to the Ukrainian surgeons that could join, really, in that shock of that first 10 days. But after that, David was there within 5 weeks, and June of that year, we were running our first full HEST course, supported by all of the incredible simulation equipment that we have designed just for us. And we've been in every Ukrainian city, so Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, Odessa, Poltava, anywhere, all of the major Ukrainian cities. And so we've just really stayed the course there. And I think continuing to, as you say, visit is important, and advocacy and letting the world that this conflict is still happening. It's a complete travesty. It's still happening 4 years later. Ukraine should have got the support it needed much sooner than this. But it's so important that we're there and we're staying the course again, as we did with Syria. Just because the media lens turns elsewhere, we won't follow that. We'll stick with where we're needed.
Yeah, and what the other thing sad is that, as I've traveled the world and worked the world, a lot of these countries, it's unfortunate they've suffered their brain drain. So a lot of the best and the brightest in the country, whether it's Ukraine or Syria or Lebanon or others, I mean, those that are amazing doctors have left the country, for other opportunities, whether it's in the UK, United States, or so forth and so on. So they're already starting at a disadvantage in some ways for medical care, right? And then so I think that, I mean, let me just ask you, are you finding that as you go into these countries? Are you finding that the fact that, I mean, there are amazing doctors in these countries, but are you finding that there aren't as many doctors as you would expect to find in a country like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a massive problem, actually. I think 70% of Syria's healthcare workers left during the course of the conflict, which is astonishing. Fortunately, in Syria's case, it's been supported by this incredible diaspora. So in Canada, the US, UK, Europe, Syria has this amazing diaspora that really sustained the Northwest and other areas throughout the years of when the country was essentially under a slight partition. So it's had that wonderful diaspora. But other countries where we've talked to aid agencies about working, say places like Central African Republic or Democratic Republic of Congo, there actually aren't the local doctors there. There are just so few trained surgeons around that would be there for us to train. So we have to get creative in terms of how we go and support them. Maybe it's one or two surgeons from our faculty operating alongside them in the operating theatre and helping them. But it's a real problem, that brain drain of which you speak. It's all about encouraging people to stay, helping support them, with scholarships, and make them feel like their work is worthwhile, and also that they have support from, the outside world.
And do you find, not to make this political, but there's always a political component to everything. I mean, do you find that like what's happened in the United States with the reduction to USAID and other countries that have been reducing their foreign aid, are you finding that that's causing additional issues around the world?
I think it undoubtedly is. I think there's a lot of questions to be asked of the humanitarian aid model as it was. And I think a lot of the criticisms of it are valid. I think there needs to be much more space for locally led action. And that's often at a much cheaper level, provided at a much lower cost than what these big, massive Western headquartered aid agencies can deliver. But just cutting it off and not reforming it was pretty brutal, and I think not the most sensitive way forward, because you've got to acknowledge that aid ultimately benefits us all. If we live in more stable worlds where people are receiving the services they need, building the institutions that really knit together a state, and there's huge issues around health security, which we've seen with the Ebola outbreak recently in the DRC. So I think it was a bit of a radical step. I'm always more in favor of gradual reform than sudden dramatic moves like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm a lifelong Republican. Foreign policy has been my issue, and a lot of people don't understand the importance of what they call soft power. I mean, America and the UK investing in these, in these countries are critical, so that I'm very simplistic. I divide the world in good versus evil. Yeah, the good guys and the bad guys. And if the good guys aren't on the front lines, then the bad guys are going to come in and take advantage of that opportunity. And speaking of that, I mean, do you find in your travels that in the absence of the U.S. and the pullback from the Western nations, do you find other countries trying to fill that void?
Absolutely. And it's a great sadness of mine, actually. I mean, one example is I've been trying very badly to learn Arabic for many years, and there used to be BBC Arabic radio as part of the World Service offering, and that was cut a few years back, and the cuts to the foreign aid budget in the UK have been, and we haven't been funding defence either, and so it's been a really grim picture, actually. And I think other countries are absolutely stepping into the void that we're leaving. You just have to look at the Russian operations in parts of Africa, human rights, and the gradual, stable reform, democratic participation. They are not on their list of things they want to achieve at all. And likewise with China, it's a very extractive economic model that they're practicing in the parts of the world, and often quite coercive as well. So other countries are absolutely stepping into the void that we're leaving, and it's a great shame. And I hope there are leaders who look to turn that around.
When I was doing work in Guyana, down in South America, the former president is a very good friend of mine, Donald Ramator, and we were talking one day because I was with the U.S. ambassador and the president, and the U.S. ambassador was saying, well, you really need to do more, show more support for America, and instead of for Cuba and Russia, and the president turned around and said, listen, I would love to, however, Cuba provides us doctors and teachers, America does not. So it's my responsibility as president to take care of my people. So if America wants to stand up and get more doctors and teachers, then I'm more willing to work with you. And it's unfortunate. I mean, that was before the cuts in USAID and others, and that's the reality. In countries, third world countries especially, if they don't have the support they need, they have to turn to whomever is willing to provide that. And of course, the people on the street, that builds a greater relationship between them and Russia and China and other countries like that. So if you were talking to governments like the UK, since you're going to have a new prime minister there in the UK, I mean, what would you say to them as far as needs and what they should be doing?
So I think the most pressing thing here in the UK at the moment is our defence. There was a strategic defence review done about a year ago, which made very clear recommendations that the government said they accepted. We've been waiting for the defence investment plan to follow that up for over a year now. And now with the latest political turbulence, it looks like that might be longer away than ever. So that's a real concern for a lot of people here. I think as well, foreign budget has supposedly been cut to make space for defence spending, but there are signs that defence spending isn't coming either. And just given our conversation today, I think we need to be far more thoughtful in how we use what we have left of our aid budget. I think more needs to go to locally led organisations, and also investing in things like the World Service and in our soft power, in our projection. And being really sensitive to the world in which we live at the moment, and making sure that we're backing up our statements. There are good examples of what we've done in Syria. There was the Aid Fund for Northern Syria, which was a UK convened multi-donor pooled fund that actually was much more successful at giving money directly to locally led organizations. But it's only by building up the states around the world where we want to make them better, and we want to see peaceful, stable nations, that we're going to achieve any kind of global stability, I think.
Yeah, once again, you're spot on. I mean, the reality is a stable country is beneficial to all of us. It's the instability what causes conflict and war, and which is then where we have to get involved and help. And so I think, and healthcare is a fundamental thing. If people are healthy, they're less inclined for conflict. If people are healthy, they're greater for the economy of the country. So healthcare, honestly, number one, is the most important thing in this part of the world or around the world. So, if you look at the WHO, for example, the U.S. pulled out of the WHO. I mean, do you think that the United Nations is doing enough? Do you think the America pulling out of the WHO was a mistake, or what are you thinking on that?
I don't think pulling out was necessarily the right thing to do. I'm more in favor of staying in the conversation and affecting reform from the inside. Major donor, America is the indispensable nation. It has a lot of power, a lot of clout. So it would have been much better to see the US stay within the WHO. And it's about, I think, continuing those conversations and affecting reform rather than, just taking a sledgehammer to the lot of it, whilst acknowledging that there are flaws in how these large international bodies are run. I think that's the thing. The further you get from the ground, you can sometimes lose sight of the importance of what you're doing. And I think, you spoke about the importance of health. Health is crucial not only in providing services, but also security and institutions. So it can be a way for, doctors to get together in syndicates, in governance bodies. They can really provide a kind of governance capacity where there is limited government. And that was certainly the case in Syria. They really, worked together astonishingly to create this degree of governance capability that was quite remarkable.
Well, sadly, we only have like a minute left. So talk about the foundation itself. If people want to learn more about the foundation and support the foundation, how would they do that?
So it's called the David Nott Foundation, and we're a UK registered charity, and we really actually are totally sustained by donations from the general public. Pretty much, we receive very little institutional funding, so it's donations from kind-hearted members of the public that really make a difference to our work. We're making such a difference. We really are. We're rather than we're a small team of about 15, so we're not a massive organization, and what we do is really tangible. We go there, we train doctors, we hear from them all the time about what they're doing with their training that they've received, how impactful it is, the lives that they're saving because of the training they've received from us. So we're always grateful for support.
Listen, Elly, it's amazing what you're doing, what you and David are doing, and sadly, we live in a world where what you're doing is important. It is necessary, and as we talked about in the monologue, sadly, once again, the amount of conflict the world is seeing is growing. And thank you for all that you do, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks so much.
Listen, thanks for being with Dane Waters. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be back with our next guest.
What we've always maintained is the never Trump movement. I'll break it down into a couple of Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of elite ivory in the world.
Live in a third world nation where your votes will get stolen if you can vote there at all.
Back to Around the World with Dane Waters, and we're going to continue this discussion about the third world countries and what's important for these countries and the absence of America and what's going on. So earlier I was able to record a conversation with a Cuban American by the name of Elio Montenegro. Elio is we talked about Cuba, what's going on in Cuba. So let's listen to the interview and we'll go from there. Thank you.